Okay, folks, well, you are here on Healthcare Unfiltered, and probably I'm very uncomfortable about taping this episode that I've told my guests because they have decided to turn the table on me and to interview me, and I have no idea how this is going to go. It's absolutely not rehearsed. I have no clue what questions I'm going to be asked, but it is fun to have two amazing individuals that I have got to know over the years. And one of them well, both of them are amazing writers, but I'd like them to introduce themselves, and then I'm gonna give them the microphone. I'll sit and take it just like a champ. We'll start with Kelly. Kelly, maybe introduce yourself to listeners of Healthcare Unfiltered.
Yeah, so I'm so excited to be here, and I'm excited to grill you with questions about your book. I am Kelly Ryerson. I blog as Glyphosate Girl. I've done a lot of work in glyphosate in terms of policy and trying to influence policy change and public awareness about this chemical. We met when I was blogging every day of the Roundup trials, sitting in the audience and saying what was actually happening, just because the reports that were coming out from the trial itself at the time were really limited. And that's why a book like the one Dr. Nabhan has written is just really awesome. So happy to be here.
And Dr. Sekeres, the author of two amazing books and a frequent guest on my podcast. I'm always grateful for you being on.
Chadi, it is always my privilege and pleasure to be here. I'm Mikkael Sekeres. I'm chief of the Division of Hematology at Sylvester Cancer Center, University of Miami, and author of the books Drugs and the FDA, Safety, Efficacy, and the Public's Trust, and of the book When Blood Breaks Down, Life Lessons from Leukemia, both from the MIT Press. And Kelly and I decided to stage a coup on Healthcare Unfiltered. We both love Chadi's book, Toxic Exposure, right here, so much that we wanted to turn the tables on him and interview him about his own book on his own podcast. So he is a reluctant captive to our being intrigued with what he wrote.
And that's how podcasts start, Mikkael. This is the beginning of your future podcast. That's how it goes. So there you go.
Never want to compete with you.
I just want to say one thing about also Dr. Sekeres, Mikkael, that he frequently writes for, I've seen your essays in the New York Times, Washington Post sometimes, and you really have an amazing way of just conveying information to the general public in a nice methodical way. Kelly also writes. You're both just very good storytellers. So I really advise any listeners and viewers to check your books, your blogs, your essays out. With that said, the microphone is yours, and I'll just stay quiet.
Thank you, Chadi. I know it's hard to relinquish control, but we're going to make you do it. It's so nice to be here. Chadi, I loved your book. I had the pleasure of reading it in galley form and ruminating over it now for months. I wanted to start out with kind of a straightforward question. How were you first identified as someone who could be an expert witness in the Monsanto trials?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in lymphoid malignancies, in lymphomas. I've written about the topic, mainly obviously on the treatment side, clinical trial side. I led several trials, so I think in the world of oncology or hematology, I would probably classify as an expert in lymphoma. I wasn't really aware of what's actually happening behind what happens in academic centers and trials and things like that. I was called by a law firm in Virginia. It's the Miller firm. They were representing various patients that alleged that they had non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of heavy exposure to Roundup. And they said they got my name from someone that they worked with before on a bladder cancer litigation trial. So he suggested for them to contact me. They contacted me, and Mikkael, I'm sure you get these calls a lot also. The calls I used to get when I was in academia were mainly malpractice cases. Can you really see this and that? And I've universally said no. A couple of times I've reviewed records just out of curiosity, but I never testified as an expert witness in court. This was not malpractice. This was very strange. It's a product liability, hazardous chemical. So I told the lawyers, I said, well, let me just do a little bit of research just to understand what that is. And I was really fascinated by what's written on the topic, because you've got two polarizing views. You do the research, you see folks saying glyphosate is the best thing since sliced bread, and it's very, very safe. And you get the people who say it's terrible. So it's very polarizing views. So I got very intrigued. But the more I did research, I was convinced that there's something going on there. There's just something there, and I really wanted to know more. And as I reviewed lots of epi studies, I was convinced that there is a link between non-Hodgkin lymphoma and Roundup, and I agreed to help the lawyers and the patients, but I had no clue how big that was. I mean, like literally, I honestly thought I didn't even know. I mean, this was way bigger than I've ever thought it would be. So it wasn't like, I thought it's going to be like, a few months, and here we are 7 years later.
So what is the process to becoming an expert witness in the courts? If this was your first time, it must have been kind of overwhelming, but how do they decide, okay, you're allowed to be admitted into this trial? Like, you seem like you're a valid, competent person.
Yeah, I mean, in academia, you end up, we all think of ourselves as experts. We have like thousands of experts. But in court, I didn't know what the process until there was, I remember, I think it was January 2018, and I got a call from Mike Miller, who unfortunately died. He won't be listening to this. I love Mike. He said, well, Chadi, you gotta be in San Francisco in like 4 weeks or something. I'm like, for what? He said, there's the Daubert hearing. I said, what is the Daubert hearing? So the Daubert hearing is a hearing where there are different standards based on the states and based on federal. Like if the trial is in federal court versus state court and all that stuff, and then various states. But the Daubert hearing is a hearing where the judge hears your methodology. So your lawyers, the plaintiff lawyers, try to tout how good your methodology is in reaching your conclusion. And the Monsanto lawyers are poking holes in your methodology. And the judge is supposed to look at the specific methodology. He's not looking at whether you're right or wrong. He's assessing the methodology of how you reached the conclusion that you have reached. So for example, you can't go in and say, well, I believe Roundup is carcinogenic or probably carcinogenic. Okay, that's great. But how did you reach that conclusion? It's almost like the methods and the statistics in a clinical trial, right?
I was just going to say the same thing, Chadi. It sounds like you underwent peer review before you could actually move forward.
But the interesting part, the reviewer is one person who's the judge. And there are different standards. So in the third trial, which was the Pilias trial, there's a standard called Sargon standard. So it's a lower standard than the Daubert hearing. The Daubert hearing is the most difficult standard. In other words, it's really the most scrutinized. There's very little mercy with that. Then there's a Sargon standard, there's a Fry standard. Each state is different. But I went through the Daubert hearing twice in the first two trials, and a Sargon standard, Sargon hearing once. But that's really then the judge decides, are you a legit expert? Am I gonna allow him to testify in what or not? So it's pretty intense.
I can imagine. I have a question that I bet either one of you could answer. What is it about Roundup that makes it cancer causing?
So if you've asked me that question, and I definitely want Kelly to comment on that, because her nickname is Glyphosate Girl, and really she's done a lot of research on this, and I've relied actually on a lot of some of the research that she's done. She generously allowed me to read a lot of her blogs. But before 2016, what I knew, Mikkael, is that I knew that farmers had higher risk of developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Like when you teach your fellows and residents, this was common thing. Like you tell your fellows benzene could contribute to acute leukemia, the same I would tell my fellows. I also knew that pesticides in general as a category increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. But I did not really delve into the type of pesticides, and are they insecticides, are they herbicides? Like I did not really, I just knew pesticides. So when I started researching, you start quickly realizing that glyphosate is a compound that is the main ingredient in Roundup. It's basically the chemical that is the most active, active ingredient. It's usually linked to surfactants that allow the compound to actually adhere to the skin and be absorbed in the skin. And there's a lot of cellular studies that showed chromosomal breakage, DNA breakage on the cellular level when glyphosate was when cells were exposed to glyphosate in vitro and in vivo. And then there were some animal studies that also looked how glyphosate induces tumor formation in mice, in rats. And then the epidemiologic studies, as you and I know, I can show you any epi study and we both can poke holes in it, right? I mean, it's not going to be an RCT, randomized controlled trial. So there are some studies that showed association and linkage between non-Hodgkin lymphoma and glyphosate, and some did not. These epi studies have inherent problems, whether it's case control or cohort studies. But when you start looking at the animal studies, cellular studies, mechanistic studies, the oxidative stress studies, and then you add to this the epidemiologic studies, despite the fact that they're not perfect, you put all of this together and you start realizing, okay, it's probably carcinogenic. It may not cause cancer in everyone. It may not cause lymphoma in everyone, and not every lymphoma is caused by it. But is it possible that in some people, it could cause lymphoma in that particular individual? In my mind, the answer is yes. Kelly, feel free to comment, but this is how my mind was thinking.
Yeah, that sounds how I would argue it too, and particularly in the framework coming out of IARC's report, very similar finding, which is at odds with what the EPA and all global regulatory officers have said in defense of this product. And another comment just on the surfactant component that oftentimes isn't talked about, because glyphosate is usually discussed in isolation. And that is because the active ingredient is the only ingredient in a formulated product that actually has to be evaluated by the EPA when they're deciding on the carcinogenicity. So they don't look at the whole formulation. Yet POEA in and of itself is a surfactant that is incredibly toxic and in fact is banned in Europe. So the Roundup that you go and you buy in Home Depot in the United States is considerably more toxic than that you would get in Europe. But the companies continue to make these formulations more toxic for Americans versus the rest of the world, which is outrageous. But that adds to the picture.
But let's go to the IARC, what Kelly offered. So then Mikkael, IARC, which stands for the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a subdivision of the WHO, they decided to look at the evidence with glyphosate. And the way IARC, the more I did research on this, the way IARC makes that decision, they decide if there's some preliminary evidence of a possibility for carcinogenicity of a compound that is very heavily used. So, they look at these and so they studied glyphosate, but IARC only reviews peer-reviewed published research. They don't look at studies that are not necessarily published. And they came up to the conclusion that glyphosate is probable human carcinogen. I think the point that Kelly mentioned is important, because you've got glyphosate and you have, in addition to it, a surfactant that is banned in Europe, but it's used here. And people don't realize the importance of that additional compound. So we're talking here Roundup, you've got glyphosate plus others. And by the way, Monsanto admitted in court documents, in depositions, in emails that were shown to the jury, that they have no long-term carcinogenicity data on Roundup. Donna Farmer, who is one of the toxicologists, they literally said that. So Monsanto admitted to that for Roundup, they don't have it because they're playing the words here. They're saying, well, we've done a lot of studies on glyphosate, which we'll go over because some of these studies were actually in a fraudulent lab. But they did say in emails, and I believe one of the depositions, that we have no long-term carcinogen studies on Roundup specifically.
So I wonder if I can ask you both a question. I have patients who come to see me who have a diagnosis of leukemia or myelodysplastic syndromes, but both of which can have an environmental or exposure etiology. So a patient is exposed to something and then years later they can develop the cancer. Often when I'm seeing patients, it's very difficult for me to get a sense of causality. So, for example, I have certainly had patients when I practiced in Cleveland who worked at a tire manufacturing plant approximately 40 miles south of Cleveland, where they would talk about standing in a vat of chemical that included organic solvents for days and weeks and months and years on end, and how their skin would break down and they'd get these sores, and then they would come and see me and they would have a diagnosis of myelodysplastic syndromes or leukemia. And I would think to myself, gee, that sounds like an awfully huge exposure to something where there might be causality. But then I would have patients who would say to me, as I kind of delved into exposures, gee, you know, there was this one summer when I was in college, I worked on this golf course and they sprayed the grass with some kind of nasty stuff. I wonder if that could have caused it. And that's an instance where I go, I'm not so sure about that. So how is it both of you think about the amount of exposure a person has to have to Roundup to then cause the lymphoma?
Yeah, this is not only a brilliant question, but it's actually a very practical question, right? I mean, as someone, you know, we've all seen patients and treated patients, so I totally appreciate that. I'll start by saying there's never 100% certainty. I think if you ever stand there and say, I am 100% sure, it is very difficult to be this absolutism of 100 or 0. It's just not possible. So you have to take everything into consideration, and then you say, it's more likely than not. I mean, that's really all you could say. It's a substantial factor. So for example, you know, let's just draw an analogy. You have someone who smoked heavily, who comes to see you and they developed lung cancer. There is nothing on the slides or nothing actually on the, maybe with time we'll find the molecular stuff that can tell you it's from tobacco or not. But for the most part, you look at the clinical history and you say, you know, I mean, possibly the smoking is what caused this, but I can't be 100% sure, but it's more likely than not. The same applies with things like this. You have to look at the entire history. The more exposure, so the way I think of things, at least in my simple brain, the more someone has had exposure, the more likely that there's some element of causation. You know, if you sprayed once in the past 10 years versus 5 days a week, every single week for the 2 years in a row, it's very different, right? That's one element. The more exposure to the skin and absorption through the skin and things just, you know, it's coming on you, again, you add another point to that, another element to that. And then you look at other factors, right? So for example, is there a possibility that there's another reason why this person developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma? Does this person have, you know, PTLD and it's EBV positive, and then you've got lymphoma? Is there high HIV positivity and a high viral load where I really can say maybe it caused it, but you know, the HIV is probably more, you know, again, there are two factors. It could be more than two factors. In heart disease, you could have diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and you could have three factors that are contributing to the disease. So the best answer I have is I use clinical judgment, clinical acumen, and I shy away from saying it's 100%. But what I can safely say in the cases I testified in, that Roundup was a substantially contributing factor in developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma. What Monsanto would argue that anything else is a factor but Roundup. It is fascinating. Like, I mean, literally, they would find the paper that said, you know, like there's one, they found a paper to suggest that school teachers, I was on the stand with this, they were actually trying, they questioned my methodology in the third trial, in the Piliads against Monsanto trial. And I have that in the book. The attorney was telling me, because they were trying to say one of the plaintiffs was a school teacher, school administrator, and they found a paper that suggested there's an association between school teachers and developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And the attorney would ask me, well, you did not consider her occupation. I said, but she's like, she worked in school. And he said, well, did you consider that in your methodology? Because if you say you didn't, then your methodology is flawed and the judge could actually dismiss you. And I said, I can't consider something I don't think it's relevant. Like it was pretty interesting dialogue and exchange. And I actually outlined that in the thing. So I think it's very difficult to always be 100% certain, but you know, you get somebody like Mr. Johnson, who is 40 some years old, who sprayed 5 days a week, every single day for about 10 hours as a groundskeeper for 2 years. He had a lot of spilling events, and despite using protective gears, and he develops cutaneous non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And that's really the only risk factor that he had for a malignancy that usually occurs 3 decades older than his age. So, you know, you put everything together and you could safely say it is a substantial factor in this case. That's how I think about it as a clinician, not as a toxicologist. Kelly, I don't know, you can comment on that.
Well, I just wanted to say about the Lee Johnson, who is the primary focus of the book in terms of who the plaintiff was. He was a school groundskeeper, and just think about that. So he's out there spraying this on the school grounds every day. You know, that is his job to go and do. And what that exposure to the kids is like at the school is just horrendous. I mean, he can't believe it now that he knows what he knows. But, you know, and the horrible thing about Roundup is it doesn't just go away. Like, you're spraying on sidewalks, then, you know, you need a rain to have it rinse off, and then it still, you know, it washes someplace else, but really horrendous. But I wanted to ask you, Chadi, about knowing all that you know with all this research and what IARC showed, how is it that Monsanto was able to, for so long, and still to this day with Bayer, because Bayer acquired Monsanto, keep this on the market? Like, how can they do that? What was exposed during the trials and in your studies that showed how they did it?
Look, Monsanto will contend, and to this day, by the way, as you all know, they've never admitted wrongdoing, despite paying billions and billions in settlements. And you know, for listeners and viewers, you know, if you really believe somebody is innocent and they'll pay about $15 billion, then you're probably crazy. Nobody's going to pay that many billions if they're really, really innocent. So whether they admit wrongdoing or not, I think the public opinion is hopefully will realize that they're admitting guilt without admitting guilt. But look, they've always gone to the EPA. The EPA has continued to suggest that glyphosate is safe. The EPA says that it is not carcinogenic, and we'll go over that because I think the EPA did not even follow their own guidelines. And they have actually, after the IARC came out with their report, they had a huge campaign, Monsanto, with papers and articles that were exposed as ghostwritten by Monsanto scientists. There's a lot of that in the book about ghostwriting. And in fact, it's almost like Mikkael will appreciate that, because there's, you know, a publisher's editor-in-chief that resigned, and like, you know, they issued a notice of concern. They did not retract the paper. It's a lot of that stuff that I call this dark side of the academy. So I think they did ghost writing, which is already exposed and well written about. I think with the EPA, they probably did a lobbying with the EPA. I don't have 100% evidence that there's collusion between the EPA and Monsanto. I cannot say that there is. I don't know. There's a lot of smoke, obviously, but it's hard for me to come out there and say I'm 100% certain. So I don't want to really say that because I don't know. But I certainly, there's enough smoke that it made me really curious. How is the EPA not really seeing this? And I tell you why I got very curious about the EPA. So the EPA Roundup came on the market, as you know, Mikkael, in 1974. So in the mid-70s. And the EPA at the time was kind of a young agency. It was just established by President Nixon, and it wasn't necessarily that thousands and thousands of people. So it was a little bit young and understaffed, and they were getting some of the toxicology studies and studies from the companies that making these pesticides, including Monsanto. And Monsanto outsourced these studies to a lab called IBT Labs. And that IBT Labs, believe it or not, is very close to where I live. I live in Deerfield, Illinois. It's in Northbrook, Illinois. That IBT Labs was found to be a fraudulent lab. They fudged data. They made up data, literally. And eventually, the founders of the lab were actually prosecuted. They, you could, and I detailed that in the thing. So their studies were not really correct studies. It wasn't just them. There were other companies that used the lab. But they never repeated these studies. And the EPA at the time, they said, well, you need to repeat some studies. Like they were not really happy with some of the studies. And they kept demanding the studies because one of the original reports of the EPA that it was possibly carcinogenic. They actually had that. But they never repeated the studies. And suddenly, a few years later, the EPA stopped demanding the studies. And then the classification switched to completely non-carcinogenic. And we don't know really what happened. So you've got the EPA asking for studies, and then the EPA stopped asking for studies. It was possibly carcinogenic, it became non-carcinogenic, and we have no idea what happened in there that made them change. It wasn't that there was studies that were presented to the EPA to show that. I mean, and I've asked that question, and I remember one of the lawyers in one of my first depositions, well, you do know that Monsanto cannot really show these studies because these are trade secrets. So we cannot really, like, if we show them, other companies could steal them. I'm like, okay. I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, that's like a red flag. So the EPA and ghostwriting, in my opinion. And look, the other thing, Kelly and Mikkael, is what Monsanto has done, the playbook, is that we are trying to save the world. We want the GMOs that we have are going to feed the world and help the hunger of the world. So because you have GMOs, you can spray Roundup on these Roundup Ready seeds, and you don't kill the seeds. You can still harvest and everything is fine. But this allows you to actually harvest and still do so all of this. So basically they're saying, we have the Roundup and the Roundup Ready. Can you imagine this? Like we have the herbicide and we have the seeds that are actually resistant to the herbicide. So I don't know. I mean, these are the things I can think about to let listeners know what they might expect.
Well, there is a sinister side to all of this. And, as I did my research for drugs in the FDA, you see that this stuff comes up over decades as well. And the FDA is a more mature government agency. It's about 90 years old now. But there were certainly periods of time when there were concerns about collusion with pharmaceutical companies and actually firing of an FDA director because people in that division were found to have colluded with pharmaceutical companies that led to drug approval. So it certainly is there. We hope that particularly with the freer availability of information, there's less and less of it over time. But it isn't ridiculous to wonder some of the things that you've wondered and write about so eloquently in your book, Chadi, about some of the darker sides, not only of academia, but of regulatory bodies and government agencies that are supposed to be there to protect our health.
I mean, I think we should ask questions. And the idea that just because the EPA said something is safe should not make us not ask questions. And that's what Monsanto is saying. Monsanto keeps saying, well, do you know more than the EPA? I'm like, well, I mean, the EPA has been wrong before. I mean, they're not, I mean, so it's the idea is, I mean, and now the EPA actually is being asked to re-review the evidence. I don't know what's going to come out of it, but I don't have a lot of trust that they're going to change their position.
Yeah, there's this bar in science and in medicine that we use for getting at truth and are debating the quality of scientific studies and trying to figure out what it is that we can take away from those studies that we can apply to patients, and what part of those studies should we question because they weren't performed as rigorously or the data weren't available. Government agencies have a lot of other kings and queens to answer to. So it isn't just the science and the data. Sometimes it can be everything from advocacy groups to political exigencies that propel government agencies to make the decisions that they make. So I absolutely agree with you. It's, something coming down from the government isn't law. And my word, did we see that in spades during the entire COVID pandemic, right? When we saw things happen in real time, and we saw at times the government get it wrong. And we saw at times the government get it really, really right.
And we have no idea. I mean, honestly, I'm very curious to see what's going on right now with the bivalent boosters with COVID and things like that. I mean, I think we are going to uncover certain things. And what America is all about is we should be free to ask questions for the better good. What Monsanto wants to do is not to ask questions. And I think it reminds me of the tobacco industry. At some point 50 years ago, smoking was cool, was good, and was healthy. And now we know it's not. And they will never change their position, in my opinion, unless they are forced to. And maybe the financial repercussions is what's going to force them to.
I would love to hear, going back to when you were testifying, what goes through your mind before you get up there on the stand? Like, how were you feeling about it? Because just sitting in the audience, I always had an underlying level of anxiety, and I wasn't even the one that was going to go up there because the Bayer attorneys, Monsanto attorneys, these are top-notch attorneys. Not that they weren't also on the plaintiff's side; it was an outstanding team too. But you just think this is who the pharma industry hires to go in and fight these enormous multi-billion-dollar battles. And you know what? Your failure actually could lead to the failure of the entire case. So what goes through your mind as you're going up there?
I was very, very nervous. I was petrified. I was so scared. You have no idea. I think my heartbeat was about 200 beats per minute. I used to have that level of anxiety if I'm giving a lecture in front of large audience, like, you get invited some, like, let's say an oral session at ASH or something, and you get a little bit nervous. It doesn't even compare. I had no idea what to expect because it's an open court. Anybody could walk in and just watch you. I think that I was just nervous. I'm going to screw things up for everybody, honestly. I mean, a lot of the people who testified before me in all of these trials were smart people, accomplished folks, and here's me. I'm going to talk. So that's what goes through my mind. I mean, I knew that they're gonna try to question my credibility right away. They're gonna go after me because that's the first thing they will do. They want to make you not credible in front of the jury. So I was so nervous. I think with time, you start getting into a groove a little bit, of getting a little bit more comfortable. That's why it's good to start with the attorneys on your side, I think. If you remember, Kelly, in the second trial, in the Hardeman trial, in the Daubert hearing of the Hardeman trial, the Judge Chabria, who's a federal judge, made a decision on the spot. Well, we're just going to start with cross-examination right away. My heart dropped because usually, the reality is the lawyers on your side, they throw you a few softballs here and there, blah, 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 because just to get you comfortable and all that stuff. They're on your side. They're not going to really. But he changed, and so we started with the cross-examination. So yeah, I was just hoping not to screw things up.
Well, and something I didn't know about trials is that, it makes sense, but they go through, so before you go up there, you have these depositions, and so you had to answer lots of questions in advance to the Monsanto Bayer lawyers. Well, then they try and catch you later on during your live testimony. And so that is terrifying too. And I know there was an instance that they tried to take something out of context and put it in front of you just to jar you. And I mean, it just seems like mental torture, frankly.
They do that all the time. The idea, they want to get sound bites. I'll give you an example, Mikkael and Kelly, just to illustrate for listeners. There was a paper that was being presented by the Monsanto attorney. It was published in JAMA, I believe. He was trying to convince me about, anyway. But he said, would you read the conclusion of the paper? Like literally in front of the judge. So I read the conclusion. I said, but however, can I just comment on this? Like, no, that's what I'm like, well, you can't just take it out of context. Like, I'm just like reading 3 lines of an entire paper. I said, there are certain elements of the paper that are very important, but they just wanted to say what they wanted to say. And they take things out of context all the time. But the good news is that when they try to dismiss my opinion, the appellate court, actually, they said, no, I mean, they took things out of context. I was really vindicated, not just me and the other experts, when they lost all of their appeals.
So, Chadi, I love Kelly's question. I wanted to take it. I wanted to back it up a little bit, for you to give us your, how you would paint a picture of your day or days in court. I mean, I was recently called for jury duty, where we went into a large room, about 150 of us, and then they announce, oh, look up on the screen, and if your name appears, that you should go out the right-hand door for this judge. And it's, I equated it to the Hunger Games and the reaping, right? You're sitting there bracing yourself, hoping your name isn't going to appear on that screen and you're going to have to go up. That's knock wood, my only exposure to the courts. So what's it like? I mean, from the moment you're walking up the stairs in San Francisco, what paint a picture of the scene for us.
I'll start from the night before. I barely can sleep because it's like you're preparing for your board exam and I don't know what to review. I read every single deposition. I try to highlight certain things that I think they're gonna go after, because they want to impeach you. They want to try to say that you're saying something now that you said differently before. They want to have like the gotcha moment. They want to do that. So I'm usually up all night reading and reviewing and just making sure that I remember every single part of the patient's case, every single study I relied on. And then the morning of, it's like literally everything just going through my mind, where I'm really very scared. I mean, I'm not going to lie. There are physicians out there, as you both know, that do this for a living. I mean, it could be pretty lucrative for people if they want to do this for a living. I don't know how much people make, but I never went into this for the money. Although that's what Monsanto tries to say, like, which is always kind of frustrating, but they know what they're trying to do. So, and then you go into the courtroom and it's really surreal for me at least, it's surreal because you're going, like, it's a very strange environment. Think of it, when you go to the hospital, it's like your home, like you're used to the hospital, like, the wards, inpatient, outpatient, this is like your house, like you really don't feel comfortable. But for an outsider that they come into the hospital, they get very overwhelmed. They look at this thing and they're like, oh my God, where am I? The same thing happens to me. Like I walk into these halls, I only saw courtrooms on TV, like, and you see, my goodness, the judge now is like, he's, wearing his robe, and I see the jury now and people are listening, and there's like, why, this yellow pads and computers, and and with Johnson's trial, at least, there was so much media coverage. It was crazy. By the time I testified, there was a little bit less media coverage, but when it started, you've got the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, everybody's on TV, the articles in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it's the first litigation trial against Bayer and Monsanto. And Bayer has just acquired Monsanto for $66 or $63 billion. So what's going through my head? I'm just scared until I get on the stand, and then I'm really it's hard to describe the psychology of it. I will never get used to it. It is why I can't do this. I can't do this. Is not a job for me. It was a message. I've done it. I've established. I think I've hopefully served a few patients, and the book hopefully will be disseminated to a lot of people. But that's it for me. I can't do this anymore. Although I'm not gonna lie, I get a lot of calls from lawyers who want me to help them.
Well, and I'm always saying, no, you need to keep going just on behalf of like all of us that are upset about environmental toxins. So from my perspective, so the way they have the everyone who comes in to testify, they like open the back door, like it's almost like a wedding coming down this aisle. Like you march by, you're like, okay, who's the next person going to be? And so they kind of parade by, and then Chatty came in, and you would not know he was nervous, just so that's out there. I mean, he has a very strong presence, as anyone who has met him in person knows, and he brought that to the court and just immediately was like witty and so smart. And
You're very kind.
No, it's true that I'm not just saying, like, it was really, and I know from my friend who is a juror that during the deposition, like some people put a heart on a Post-it and put it up like next to his name. I mean, he was that.
Thank you, Kelly. That's the background details we were hoping for.
Oh yeah.
I've got a little heart on a Post-it right now, Chadi.
Right. They literally loved him. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of people call and ask for his testimony, because it is very convincing on all fronts.
That's amazing. It's hilarious also. Yeah. Chadi, you do a wonderful job in the book, and you write beautifully about some of your patients, like Mr. Johnson, who went through this, and you can tell it just leaps off the page how much you care about these people on an individual level. Can you tell us about one of the patients, some of the details about what happened to that person, and what's happened to them since then, since the trial has occurred?
Yeah, I mean, a lot have been talked about Johnson, so I'm going to talk about the Piliads instead of the Johnson, because Johnson, it was the first case, understandably got a lot of attention. The Piliads was an interesting case. These were a couple, a husband and a wife. They were married for about 30 years. The husband developed diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. For listeners, this is an aggressive type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and it's the most common one. And the wife developed primary central nervous system lymphoma. So it's also of the large cell type, but it is in the brain only. Now, they both had heavy exposure to Roundup over the years, and they both developed lymphoid malignancies. And they actually obviously sued Monsanto, and they won. I bring this case for two reasons. Number one is Monsanto would always say, well, they're old, pretty much. Like, you know, if you're old, you could develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Now, I'm not disputing that lymphoma is a disease that folks, median age is close to 70, 65 to 70. But that should not preclude us from investigating a cause in somebody who is older. I mean, if you get an 80-year-old with a heart attack, don't you ask them, don't you try to control their blood pressure or check their hemoglobin A1C and look at, so again, I bring this up because the idea that Monsanto they're old, they have a lot of comorbid conditions. So what if they get non-Hodgkin lymphoma? This is to be expected in somebody their age. And as somebody who's done a lot of work in geriatric oncology and geriatric lymphoma, I've taken an offense to that. I was very, very upset about this. I said, well, that's almost discriminating against older people if you don't want to investigate causation in folks who are older than a specific age. And the second thing I bring up, which is really interesting about this couple, is I said in court, you know, it's common sense if you have a husband and a wife who've developed the same disease to try to think what they both were exposed to, like what's really the denominator. And my God, as if I like opened hornet's nests, because now Monsanto said, well, Nabhan is relying on common sense for causation. I'm like, I didn't say that. Like, I didn't even say that. I just said it's common sense to look at what they were, like they literally, in their motion to dismiss my opinion, they said, I've relied on common sense. complete distortion to my testimony. And the judge, the appellate judge, read the testimony and he literally wrote back like, this is not what he said. And he was very upset with how they actually portrayed this. But isn't it a common sense? I mean, my God, I mean, if you have somebody in the household who has diarrhea, the first thing you ask if the other folks in the household ate the same thing and they had the same food poisoning. I mean, just the way we work and operate, but they cling to anything, which to me, it means a point of desperation. You're desperate if you have to pay close to $15 billion. I hope they're listening to this. I think
I'm sure they are.
Yeah, well, they're listening because they want to see any sound bites. They could say, "Why? Look what he said now. He did not say that before." But the thing is with this couple, like I said, it's common sense just to ask the question what they were exposed to, and in my mind, they were exposed to the same herbicide. The last I checked on this couple, they won with a large verdict, $2 billion, $1 billion each. Obviously, it came down since. They both remain alive to my knowledge, although it's been a year since I've checked on that. I believe one of the wife has had a relapse in her disease, but I don't know 100% what's going on there.
It's interesting, Chadi. It's the what you hear on television all the time. Anything you say can and will be held you in a court of law. For somebody who has testified multiple times, you really have to think about that, though, because anything you say in a public context can and will be captured by the defendant's lawyers and could be used against you. Even
I do know that. In fact, sometimes I tweet something specific because I know they're going to see it. I mean, I've done that sometimes the night before the deposition because I totally know they will see it. I mean, one of the depositions that I was in, I remember meeting one of the attorneys who apparently knew that I was a Patriots fan. As you know, I love the Patriots and I love Tom Brady. And he was a Giants fan, and he was telling me about. I'm like, how did he even know I was a Patriots fan? That was the time when I knew. I'm pretty sure they're watching my tweets and whatever I say. But there are times where I've actually specifically put something on Twitter because for example, I would say that we would need to investigate causation even in older patients because I knew they were going to read that. It's like a subtweet, as we say right now. But I agree with you. They will be watching because the whole idea is to really show some inconsistency because this actually might help them.
So then are you
By the way, I've taken a lot of your time, so feel free to give the table back to me whenever you're done. Don't feel obligated to keep going. I know you're all busy with schedule, but I love this turning the table. I feel like Mikkael is going to have a podcast very soon. Okay.
Kelly, you see how territorial he's gotten about this, right? He's encouraging us to give it back to him, so we should keep going for at least another couple minutes.
Oh yeah, clearly. Sorry, my dog's going crazy. I wondered, what is next for you with the trials? Are you done now that you have this book published?
Well, I never thought I was going to publish a book, but I'm happy that I did. I hope a lot of folks check it out and just learn a little bit about my mindset, but more importantly, that how sometimes nuances in science evolve, because ultimately, I've said that 100 times, science is not perfect. If Dr. Sekeres has to rely on 100% science in every leukemia patient he treats, he will not be able to treat a lot of patients. There's some element of this clinical judgment, expertise, nuances, understanding how you put one and one together to reach a decision how you help patients. You cannot sit there and say, well, I'm not convinced 100%, so I'm not going to do anything. There's only one trial that I'm still named in because it got delayed for 5 years because of COVID. I was deposed in that trial in 2018, in November 2018, and was deposed again in December 2019, and then things went dark for several years. It is slated to go to trial to court in late April, beginning of May 2023. Almost 5 years since I was deposed in it. I don't know if it will, it might, but if that's the case, I will be testifying to the prognosis and the diagnosis of that patient. There's somebody else who will be testifying in the specific causation, but that's really it. I believe there will always be lawsuits with this. It's like the asbestos thing. I think there will always be some patients who opted out of the settlement. There will be some lawyers taking cases. But I think for the most part, it's going to be fewer and fewer cases with time. That's what I think. For me, I think that's it after this one. I have no mental or physical capacity anymore. I'm drained.
Well, Kelly Ryerson and I have been here in a friendly coup, taking over Healthcare Unfiltered to talk about Chadi Naban's book, Toxic Exposure. I recommend this to everyone. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It's incredibly well written. It's brilliant in how it covers a lot of issues around toxic exposures and how this actually plays out in the court system, and more importantly, how it affects our patients. And I wonder, Kelly, are we going to hand this podcast back to Chadi, or are we going to keep it for ourselves?
Well, I don't know. Could you do a weekly? You and I.
Hey, listen, this is how it starts. I think you could start with a show, and you never know. I've been doing these podcasts now for 4 years. My first podcast was in February 2019, and I enjoy it. My podcast, as you know, is never about me. It's really about the guest and just trying to highlight guests and learn. But I really appreciate you both spending time with me and turning the table and asking really very important questions about these litigations and these trials in the book.
Anyone who is wavering on buying the book, don't, because it's such an important story. It's so entertaining. You're gonna be so happy just to pick up these bites of information about how things like this go down, not only from a legal standpoint, but also regulatory. And it's just exciting and informative. And I can't state enough how much, what a great piece you've written.
Thank you. You both are very, very generous with your time, with your endorsement. I cannot thank you enough. And if they're listening, they have to write a quick blurb on Amazon, because that will help, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great book, Chadi.
Thank you so much, guys.